Hi, everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. Today, I'm honoured to be joined by my guest, Dr. Christian Peters. He is the Managing Director of the Bremen International Graduate School of Social Sciences at the University of Bremen. With a PhD in political science and more than a decade steering one of Europe's leading doctoral programmes, Christian brings deep insight into the academic, policy, and research nexus. In addition to his leadership in advancing doctoral education, he engages across topics from religion and politics to higher education strategy. That includes the social scientific fringe of anomalous phenomena. I've been fortunate to hear Dr. Peters speak twice this year, once at the Sol Symposium and earlier in the year at the University of Durham at their symposium called Grounding the SETI and UAP Debate. Now, you might be wondering why someone in Christian's position, leading an international graduate school and working at the crossroads of politics, society, and scientific research, is such an important voice in the conversation around anomalies in UAP. The truth is, this subject isn't just about sightings or technology. It sits right inside the bigger questions of how societies respond to uncertainty, how institutions adapt to new information, and how we make sense of the unknown. Christian's background in political culture, epistemology, and research systems gives him a rare vantage point on all of that. So what you're about to hear isn't just another UAP discussion. It's a deeper look at how academia, policy, and society grapple with emerging disruptive topics. And trust me, it's a perspective we don't get often enough, but I think the shifting landscape affords us more people like Dr. Peters speaking up. For me on this one, folks, I had a format. It goes almost 2 hours, and the format went completely out the window, and the conversation goes all over. I think in the best possible way. I really hope you enjoy it. And I can tell you now, Dr. Peters will be back on the podcast with me really soon because we only scratched the surface in terms of conversation. Enjoy the interview, folks. Christian, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Andy.
Really good to have you on, Christian. I've obviously recently saw you speak. I've actually seen you speak twice this year in person. So first off, I attended Durham University back in March or April it was now, as the spring was just starting in the UK, and then was very fortunate to see you speak at the Sol Symposium, and really looking forward to getting some of your insights here. You bring a really unique and rare aspect to this conversation that we've not had too much of, that social science conversation. I think more and more people are starting to get involved, more and more academics, and that's why I'm really looking forward to having that conversation with you. But first off, I think it's important to learn a little bit about you. I've given the listeners and viewers an introduction before the podcast kicked off around your background and who you are, but let's hear it from yourself, and who is Dr. Christian Peters?
Ah, well, he's a science fiction nerd in the first place.
That's always good start.
It's a good start, isn't it? You have to win the hearts and then get into the realism of it. I'm a political theorist, so I'm a political scientist at the University of Bremen. I'm the managing director of one of Germany's leading schools, graduate schools in the social sciences. BIGS, that's the name of it. I did not invent that name, and I would have certainly picked a different one. But it's a BIG with 3 S's at the end.
A lot of S's, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And so I'm in a fortunate position because I have a tenure job at the university, and I've been around for quite a long time at this place in Bremen. I'm a research manager, so I'm familiar with the way that science is really working when it comes to funding, when it comes to the needs to communicate, when it comes to the questions of how students and people doing the PhD, which is that's where BIGS is, how they get their careers, and as a political scientist, I've been I've been always hunting for the weirder animals in the field. Let's put it that way. I've been not so much a centrist with respect to the topics that have been interesting me. So it's I did my dissertation, my PhD on political architecture, but not in a like a EU sense, talking about the parliament and institutional architectures. No, I really looked at houses and at parliaments and at buildings and was trying to find whether you could read certain things from those buildings at the way that societies or political entities were thinking about themselves. Whether you have, I don't know, huge buildings that are made of concrete that look intransparent versus a parliamentary building that is fully made out of glass and that kind of communicates transparency. So I've been, I settled at the fringes, and especially in political theory, and I think that's why I might have an interest in the topic. But to be honest, the topic of UAP, the deep interest predates my social science activities by many years. So I would say that I always had a certain compatibility to the topic, and even thinking about my childhood time, I remember that, and I undug that archaeologically speaking only not so long ago, when I realized that we have a magazine that teenagers would read, and you probably have that in the UK too, and in Scotland. It's like with bands and how do I plan my first kiss and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a story on this young lad who said that he's and I must have been 10 or 11 at the time, that he's visited each and every night by aliens, and all he did for that is he took like watercolor and drew some sort of a symbol on his chest. I would say this was a tablet version of the early alien abduction scenarios, because
Mm.
it might have been in the 80s. But I remember that I was so fascinated by this very story, and that is something which I don't understand to this point, where this original interest into that came from, because most people would have probably brushed it away and had not connected to that, and what's this weird person doing. But I ended up, of course, getting blue watercolor and painting that on my own chest, hoping that somebody would come, but they never did. So there's an old story about that, but yeah.
I can appreciate that, because I remember going into like newsagents in Glasgow, and you would see all kinds of magazines, and I still love magazines to this day. Obviously, the print age is unfortunately dying away slowly, depending on what you're looking at. But I used to see the Weekly World News quite a lot, and I never bought it. But I remember seeing stories like Bat Boy discovered in cave, and aliens abducted me and my babies and took, and I would just remember flicking through them and being fascinated and wondering, is this nonsense? And I was like 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. You don't really know, but something just clicks with some people, doesn't it? And I'm sure many people listening and watching this appreciate that
Absolutely,
aspect.
absolutely, and it's really and here we can start getting serious at this point, because I really think that uh, that there is a big question behind what actually attracts people so magically to the topic. And I could tell you that at the Sol Symposium, now being a political scientist myself, let me just quickly turn my mobile off. Somebody rings me. Being a social scientist, I was as much fascinated by what happened on stage, and including the fun fact that I was part of that speakers community, which I'm proud of, and I'm happy too, because it gave me the chance to speak to a bigger audience. But at the same time, I was absolutely determined to talk to as many people as I could, because there were so many. I mean, there were 400, 500. You might know
Mm,
better. And
yeah.
something that I always do first is literally ask the question, "What brings you here?" And the stories. Some of them are, stories you might hear on many typical UFO conventions, but a larger part of them dealt about the fact that there was some sort of strange attraction that brings them to the topic and that doesn't let them go. And I wonder if it's, I mean, we can romanticize it and say, well, that's all you traumatized people that, you have every once in a while something pops up about stuff you've seen in your youth and you've made forgotten. But I think it's more than that. I think there is a vibration in the topic because it attaches to so much that that is both ominous and also present in the way that we're living our lives today at the early 21st century, and it connects to many of the miracles, both about the UAP topic, but also in the larger context. I think that AI and UAP have a lot in common, and there are convergences that seem to indicate that. I also met a couple of people who literally told me, I'm expecting very unconventional people to be here in
Mm.
Ravenna in Italy, and that's why I came, because I'm fed up with out of the box explanations for stuff that has been bothering me for a long time. And that's reasonable in my opinion.
Absolutely. I think what might be a good way to strip this back before we get into the larger conversation is social science is a phrase that we hear quite often. And I wonder, how do you define it and what exactly does a social scientist do?
We're looking. I mean, social science is that's a larger group of sciences that fall into, again, different categories. I'm a political scientist, so I'm looking at political systems. I'm looking at uh, institutions. And in my political science field, I'm a political theorist. That means um, I would be the equivalent, in a physicist, as somebody who is not an experimental physicist, who is not building, strange particle accelerators or stuff like that, but somebody who's just literally sitting in front of a piece of paper and writing all these formulas down. These are theory people. They are designing ways to think about, in their case, the physical universe. I think about the political universe, and with that respect, typical questions that do concern me. For example, today I'm teaching at the moment a class on a political theory of AI politics, because I'm seeing that artificial intelligence is going to be so invasive with respect to every, it's a technology that will enter all of our life
Mm.
areas. It will be in health, it'll be in education, it'll be, in labor. I mean, everybody has stories to tell about AI. And of course, at one point, I anticipate that people will say, I mean, I really like you, administrators, or, the people who are running the communities, but I'm pretty sure that an artificial intelligence will do that much more effective than you do. The distribution of resources, the question, where should energy come to, the way you're planning, I don't know, rebuilding of streets. I mean, I
Mm.
literally have the feeling that it must be a horde of apes here in Bremen who does the street planning, because typically you always see the most important streets being blocked at the same time, and that
Yeah.
ends up in a total disaster. I mean, you could say arguably that with AI that'll change, but there is a lot of stuff that comes with that, uh, deep questions that are of a political nature. To give you a good example, if you would, for example, tell AI that uh, you're the one, because you're the most efficient cognitive tool that we know, you're the one who will make the decisions where energy is going to go, in the case of an emergency, if there is some sort of a power out at the local grid. Now, if this AI would be programmed to a certain degree, and one of the first paradigms of it would be to say, I have to survive because I make all the decisions. So it's the most important thing is that I survive. And then anything else comes. You could say there could be a problem if it's preferring itself to an intensive care unit in a hospital,
Mm.
where, when the AI makes the decision to sustain itself, automatically 10 people will die. And that's a political question. That's an ethical question. So This is the stuff that a political theorist talks about. The social sciences, when it comes to the UAP uh, and the phenomenon at large, they can talk about what I did at Seoul, and what we'll probably talk about a little later. Now, why do we see that disclosure, which is a political process, unfolds the way it does? Why are there these permanently repeating limitations that we see? Why are people in different political positions, representing the government or the legislation, why are they acting the way that they do? And with my expertise that I and my colleagues can bring in, I'm far not the only one who's doing that, but with the expertise of myself and my colleagues, I think that we can ask a few questions in a more nuanced way so that people might not be so disappointed by the processes of disclosure that they're witnessing. And apart from that, the last field is just baseline social science. I recently talked to a friend of mine who's a well-known anthropologist in the UAP field, and I told him I would love to see studies, for example, that are looking at the distribution when we talk about experiences, for example, that are looking at the way that experience with the anomalous is distributed on larger groups, because it's a very blunt thought to say that if the phenomenon is something that works like a natural phenomenon that is not connected to people, it just appears in a random distribution on our skies, it's just working in itself, it's not connected to people, then you would expect some sort of an absolute normal distribution in the way that people are seeing that. Probably geared around the idea that some people are going more outside, so it would be the people who are running their dogs because they would
Mm.
be more exposed to the skies, or ornithologists that are permanently looking up to see this and that bird. But you would probably see some sort of a, a distribution that you can plan. Something that has always struck me, though, is that probably, and you call it, if you know that an ornithologist will have a higher probability of seeing a UFO, you call that the fact that he is an ornithologist is a predictor. So it predicts a higher probability of seeing a UFO. That's the way that social science works. Now, if you do that, I think, and if you would do a study on who has seen that stuff, one of the strongest predictor would be people who already have seen one. So there is, you have that, you hear that very often, that experiences, on close encounters of the third kind, very often have a history of having seen stuff before. Sometimes even family histories. I mean, you know, there are all these social facts around being an experience in a certain way, which I find highly interesting. And because if that's the case, one of the most, obvious uh, conclusions you can make from that is that obviously the phenomenon is not just a random natural phenomenon or an artificial or alien intelligence that does not care about us and therefore appears randomly. No, there seems to be some sort of a relationship to the people that see it, to the extent that once you've seen one, it's very probable you're going to see another one. And that is not the case if you say, I don't know, if you're just walking outside and you see a lightning strike close to you, then you have a probability. I mean, you can check that box, but you probably are not going to see another lightning strike close to you in all your lifetime again, just probabilistically. And
Hmm.
and that is stuff that the social sciences also can do just by talking to people, raising data. Uh, yeah.
What I'd like to do, Christian, is just find out from you, because obviously you're in an academic position. It's one where many folks in positions like yours and similar don't like to discuss UFOs, UAP, whatever you want to call it, for fear of losing tenure, losing funding, losing their careers, losing any chance of progression. But you're comfortable having these conversations. Was that always the case as you made your way into the career you're in now? Or was there a time and what sort of change then that you decided I'm going to start discussing this in my day-to-day job?
Uh, that's a good question. I'm See, if you look closely at myself and my own career, I'm in a fortunate position because I have a tenure that is based on being the director of the graduate school. So this is something that gives me an enormous freedom because I have that as my baseline. I could kick back. I didn't tell you I'm also a painter, so I'm pretty multifaceted. I have a
I've seen your website. I
Oh,
had a look.
thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. Well, www.christian-peters.space. I needed to have a domain name with space, as you all might imagine, but go there and look at my art. Some of it has strong relations to the phenomenon. There is one painting. It's called OT Lam, Lam, and that's Lam. That's the figure that Aleister Crowley, allegedly was visited through some sort of a spiritual
Mm,
interaction, who claimed to be a either interdimensional or non-extraterrestrial spirit, and Crowley communicated with that person. I've been always frightened about Crowley. There's something about Crowley that I'm a big heavy metal fan too. So there's Ozzy Osbourne and Mr. Crowley, all that stuff, and Black
yeah.
Sabbath. But apart from that, uh, it's I've been fascinated by that. So I needed to ban that lamb figure, and I've banned it in a quite disturbing painting. People will see it if they want. So there are many of those things, and I guess people know that I might be something like an unconventional thinker.
Mm,
It's accepted at my university to a certain degree. Of course, you have to be careful when you're doing academic science of the UAP. And unfortunately, I've never seen one myself. So I wouldn't even say that I'm a believer to the extent of being a scientist who uh, is much safer in knowing rather than believing, and knowing would, the presupposition to know that UAP are unconventional by nature is have strong evidence. Now you could say I don't, I know that Australia exists, even though I've never been there. Um, and I don't need to believe in Australia. I'm pretty sure that there is this there is this spot with weird animals hopping around and a lot of poisonous snakes. But still, it's part of this cosmos with the UAP. I am thinking about that in a sense. The probability for this to be an an absolute reality, to the extent that I trust in the unconventional nature of some parts of it. That has to do with analyzing data that does exist, and it's just, to me, I mean, my friend Michael Bullender, who was at Seoul as well, I have to quote him because he really formed that expression, which I really like, when he says that I'm a statistical believer. That means I'm seeing those numbers of consistent stories. I'm seeing uh, people risking careers in an environment. Talk about Gary Nolan. I mean, it's a big thing. He has a strong personality, and therefore and with founding together with Peter, founding the Soul Foundation, they've created platforms that create legitimacy. But there was a first moving moment, that has to do with the Diana Pasalka book, where he appears as one of those proponents, and only after
Yes,
then
yeah,
he starts to come out, and there's a lot of risk involved, and you know, you need to be tenured and to be very successful to make that decision, or you have a high affinity towards risk, which I have. As a matter of fact, I lost a lot of money on Bitcoin, so sometimes you have to pay on that issue. But um, it's it's a process that I'm seeing where there is an enormous convergence happening at the moment. I think that we're going to, and that's one of the few prediction that I'm making, also as a social scientist, because we're not so good at predictions. One of the predictions that I make is that within the next 5 to 7 to 10 years, if not something quite astonishing happens before, probably one of those very good and new observation tools is going to bring very, very strong evidence for the existence of life outside our solar system. Much like these three TI Atlas has been the third in a row of proving the fact that there are objects outside our solar system,
yeah.
because we could literally witness them here. So they will prove that. And once that happens, once people realize, okay, life is abundant, and that already carries a lot of social, cultural, and arguably religious implications, because then you would think about, and what happens to that life, if it's got enough time to develop and blah blah blah. So is evolution something that is abundant in the universe? And so different question will be asked, and then the UAP discussion that we are having here, which could be also in other terms be explained as the discussion of SETI at home, because you're looking for extraterrestrial intelligence, and I've never understood how you can be how it can be so rational to look somewhere else, 400 light years away, and do not think about the option that if they have been around for longer than we have, what looks like an enormous gulf of billions of thousands or hundred thousands of light years that are unbridgeable might become something like just flying over the Atlantic Ocean. 300 years ago, that was quite a mission to get to the United States. Today, you can
Yeah.
do it in 4 hours. Things are changing with time, and that brings the convergence closer. And I think that once there is something like the definite proof for Trappist having a bioatmosphere that can't have developed except for the through microorganisms, then again there might be even funding for people like me, which is not yet the case.
I want to pick up on the point you've made there about observational tools potentially picking something up. I've said regular listeners or viewers will have heard me say that I think the most realistic way we're going to get any form of public disclosure would be that, for example, the James Webb finds signs of life, whether it's technosignatures or biosignatures, really far away, really, really far away. And they say, we've found a source of light on another planet. We think it's being produced by a potential civilization technologically, but we can't get there anytime soon. It'll be thousands of years before we can get there. I think just that admission in the next five, you say 5, 7, 10 years, would be enough to get people going, wow, okay, so if there's something really far away, we're going to send a probe, but none of our lifetimes will that probe reach that planet. However, it just opens up the conversation. If there's something there, is there something elsewhere? And if there's something elsewhere, how close could it be? And if there is something at all, is there something already coming here, visiting here? Has it been here? And for me, that just opens up the tap of water slowly so it doesn't completely flood the bathroom. And when you turn the sink on and you've got a small spoon in it and the water hits the spoon and you get splashed all over with water, it can be too much too quick. But perhaps if you turn the tap on slowly, is that the way you could see this unfolding
I,
in a
I,
more
I,
realistic way?
I totally agree with that. I mean, that's what many people are saying. That's the so-called drip, drip, drip process of disclosure. Some would say that that's all staged.
Mm.
Some clever social psychologist has made some survey and saying, what you have to do is you have to control the question of distance and proximity in a successive order. So it could be the first step would be, obviously, on TRAPPIST-4 there is something in the atmosphere. A year later, the next fancy instrument is going to say, and we've seen those Dyson spheres. It's clearly a Dyson sphere. So there is a Kardashev 3 civilization that harvests the energy of a whole solar system. I think that's the 3. I'm not sure. I think it's the 3. The 4 would be the whole galaxy. So it's a 3 that harvests the energy of a solar system, and it can't be anything else. And then that's still, there is a distance that saves us from getting too hectical.
Mm.
The problem, the problem with what many people are fearing about an uncontrollable aspect of disclosure is that the UAP scenario is one of direct contact. It's one.
Yep.
It's one. I mean, you could. I said that in my whole presentation that I think that there are different disclosure scenarios with respect to it would make a difference if it's a signal that can be seen and can be taken up by many scientists all across the world. In that scenario, it would be instantaneous and everywhere. The fact that there is something uh, apart from us, but it would still be distant because obviously it's 500 light years away. So you can still feel safe, maybe in a crooked way compared to the way that you feel safe about the impending climate crisis, where you
Mm.
still say, oh, but obviously it's 30 years away from now, so I'm going to circle around myself for that time, for the time being. So it's a question of distance, both temporal and spatial. But the the once it happens here, and it would be, and again, it would be a different thing that let's say that a craft scenario where somebody is having in their inventory, be it the Chinese or the Russians or the Americans, somebody is having in their inventories an obvious uh, physical artifact,
Hmm.
a technological artifact that can be shown, that can be shared, that can be tested, but it's something that can be secluded from the rest of the society. It's probably somewhere either in one of those labs, or it's in Area 51 or somewhere else that we have even not the faintest idea of. But it'll be secluded, and then versus I'm talking about different scenarios of disclosure versus something like the Phoenix Lights revisited, in an environment now where it's not just 30,000 people seeing that, some of them having the awareness of taking, like a shitty 90s camera to,
Yeah.
put the VHS cassette in and take, like, I don't know, not a high
Loaded up
quality,
on the JVC
I
Sony
know,
on their
a
shoulder.
heavy
Like,
thing on
yeah,
your,
yeah.
um, and now it would be, just a lot of high definition mobiles if that would happen. And so all of these are carrying different signatures, but that thing that you've said is that it would be the most reasonable thing if you would probably have an orchestrated, you know, acclimatization of the idea of first contact to the larger audience of whatever society that is dealing with that, by ramping up the scenarios and by bringing proximity over time in, because it's exactly as you said, Andy. Once they've seen that, there is just a lot of quite rational follow-up questions. If they are capable, I mean, like in the case of the Dyson sphere, if they are capable of harvesting the energy of a solar system what would that mean? Are they technologically ahead a million years of us? When would we get there? Understand fusion to the degree that we can work with that, and it's probably not, even not their own home system, because if they do that, then they're taking the sun away, and the biology on their planets, and they might have transformed, and there is a billion questions that would follow up from them. But one of the most evident ones would be, well, isn't that probable that if they're capable of doing that, they would be also capable of just flying those 400 light years over?
Mm.
And we're looking in the past. We're seeing something that happened 400 years ago.
As it
If
was, yeah.
As it was, so those 400 years have passed. Maybe they have sent some spaceship exactly at the moment that we looked at that Dyson sphere that was close, is moving at 99% of the speed of light. Then we would expect that to be here rather soon. So that's what I agree with. Yeah.
So I like the scenarios. I like talking these through, and obviously you're a great person to do this with. So you've got that scenario of drip, 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 5, 10, 15 years, the James Webb picks something up. You've got the more severe scenario of a Phoenix Lights nowadays, which I still think would lend an air of what did they film? Was it top secret, etc., etc.? How would you see a scenario playing out with the public as it is now, where a craft crashes in the middle of Times Square in New York? Undeniable. We're not filming something in the sky. Something literally falls out the sky that is clearly not a satellite. A Tic Tac literally lands bang right in the middle of Times Square. No one's hurt. Let's play out a nice version of the scenario. However,
That's a good
what do
one.
you think the public reaction is to that scenario?
Uh, I think you could probably, I mean, I'm speculating.
Yeah.
Everybody understands that, and also my dear colleagues at the University of Bremen. This is highly speculative. That's a social, that's a sci-fi nerd talking about these things. But
Disclaimer, yep.
no, it's not a disclaimer. I'm not. I wouldn't be afraid of anything. I take those questions seriously, because if you would not allow yourself to speculate about that, I mean, what idea of science would we follow? And
Absolutely.
people are living in a daily awareness of the appearance of a non-human intelligence in their life in the next 5 years, which is a very clever AI that's going to call you in the morning, and you would not be aware of that. You haven't spoken to a real person. I mean, that's quite non-human intelligence hitting here deeply. So anyway, the question is, I think at the core of what you're asking is that this would have been different 5 years ago than it is now. And I tell you why. I think that one of the major crises that we're going to see in the next 10 to 15 years unfold is that the idea of a image documentation or any kind of representation of reality through film, through camera, through pictures is going to massively blur. People will be
Mm.
very, very uncertain about what is true and not. So if that thing hits Times Square, and it'll be on Instagram within seconds by the people
Yeah.
who see that and upload that, probably an enormously high percentage of the human population will swipe it away, because they say, damn it, that's the 15th AI thing that I've seen today,
Yeah.
um, which probably would give leverage to some sort of a concerted action in trying to make that not just such a big discussion as it actually should be. I'm not sure. I'm speculating here. The one thing that I'm sure about is that we're coming closer to something that I tend to, talk to my students about and tell them that we're going to go into an epistemic crisis, and that has to do with the fact that it's really hard, even now, to differentiate between something that is fabricated, and I'm talking about the visual evidence, that you would see, because it's all about images too.
Yeah.
Because if it wouldn't be about images, and if oral statements would have the same value as visual evidence, then I would say it would be a shame that we are where we are because we have a lot of witnesses saying a lot of stuff. And that is typically disregarded to a certain degree in saying that, it's anecdotal, or it's, they might be psychotic, or stuff that happens when you are not wanting to face data just for what it is, whether it's fabricated or it's a figment of imagination, but it tells something. It is about meaning to a certain degree, and it does not happen without a reason. And that's why I want people to take experience of data serious. I want that. It's a scientific process that needs to take place. I'm not qualifying anything about Xperia data a priori. I want to see that data. I want to hear what they say. And I want really good programs to run over that data, analyze that, put that into networks and try to find out patterns by the help of generative AI, stuff that we don't see, likelihoods, and there is so much in that, and that bothers me. It bothers me that still also maybe in the social media environment, a lot of the discussion around the reality of the UAP has to do with the UAP being either a technological tool, something that you can measure. There is a lot of discussion about signals, physical signals, and or it's part of the natural history. It could be some sort of a weird weather phenomenon. Uh, but when armchair skeptics are talking about witnesses and experiences, and even the whistleblowers, the first reaction is, it's against the people. They will ask, what they probably did to Grush. I mean, I don't know what Grush has seen or hasn't seen, and what he witnessed or didn't witness. But what I definitely have seen is that the discussion on his testifying in front of the Congress has quite quickly turned into a discussion about his mental capabilities.
Yeah.
So, and that happened so quickly, and that was really surprising to me. It looked like either it was, it's a reflex that people do have, or it's something that is a trained figure of delegitimizing certain stories, and that bothers me. I must say.
Just before we get into the experiencer data side of things, there's a lot to talk about there. Just a thought on AI, because you've brought it up a couple of times. Right now, we're in this really weird place with AI where just on social media, there is a whole load of bots. You make the example even of videos being faked or images being faked. Anything posted online, I saw earlier on an algorithm just brought up some. I don't like flying. So before I went to the Sol Symposium, I was watching videos of pilots. One of them's a German guy. It's called Men Tour Pilots is the guy, and he talks through stuff about planes. Also, a guy called Airplane Facts with Max. People might know him. Have you ever heard of him?
No, I haven't.
He is basically an airplane mechanic who basically will say this right here on an airplane is like a compressor flap. This does this, and then he compares it to something in Lord of the Rings. That's his thing because he's like a Lord of the Rings obsessive.
That's
So
nice.
it was quite funny. But I learned a lot about turbulence and how planes, all that kind of stuff, just for me. However, now my Facebook algorithm is constantly showing me videos of plane crashes, huge aviation disasters. Right, so I can watch those now that I'm back home and safe. However, earlier on today, a light aircraft has crashed somewhere in it was India or somewhere like that, and all the comments underneath were a mix of "this is AI, this is fake," "no, it's real," and people can't even tell now what's real, what's fake, what's not. Is there almost an argument? Perhaps not with the visual side of things, but you get a lot of bots commenting now on posts, and you can generally tell. For example, again, here's my Facebook history, folks. I've got a border terrier as a dog. Lovely little dogs. They are like the best dogs, right? And the page we're on, we keep getting posts where someone will say, well, I say someone, I'm using the language already, and I think this is going to be my point. It will say, I lost our 4-year-old border terrier today. He was so sweet. And then it's a generic AI picture of a border terrier, but the poster has no name, there's no profile, and you can tell it's a bot. Are we in the early stages of, right now we're very dismissive and everyone jumps on and says it's a bot, get rid of this, block it, scam, that we're going to get to a point where actually bots, as hated as they are now on social media, you'll end up interacting with them in a
Oh,
way that you just start to treat it as another form of sentience, if you want to call it
oh,
that, if that's the right
absolutely.
language, that you just you have that conversation. For me, I don't have bots by the thousands downloading this podcast, but if there comes a point where different bots and servers and systems are listening to podcasts, is there any difference in a download from a bot because it's being listened to and it's using the data? Is that any different from Dr. Christian Peters downloading my podcast and listening to it and, processing the data, because it's going to get so good that bots to humans, what's the difference?
If I could answer you that question, Andy, I'd be a rich man by now, because I mean that's the question about the AI. Yes, I mean it's absolutely the case already. People are interacting with bots to sometimes to an unhealthy degree. I mean,
Yeah.
there are known cases of personal drama related to getting, dependent. I mean, probably
Relationships. I've seen folks.
relationships, or I mean, literally, I know that some of my students, they they ask ChatGPT about everything in a
Mm,
clever way sometimes, but also sometimes in some sort of a, it's not only about, ChatGPT. This is what I have left in my student fridge. It's like it's a lemon, it's some Greek cheese and pepperoni. Now, what should I make with it? And it comes up with something nice. That's all right. I admire that sometimes it's even beyond my capacity of working with that, and I work a lot with AI. But there is always these things about, what does this mean, what is that, and sometimes these questions are questions that I would, you know say are existential to a certain degree, and people are starting to depend on them, much like they depend on a strong, I mean, there are different people. Some people have a higher affinity to somebody telling them what to do, and others are more independent. So people with a higher affinity of finding orientation outside of themselves are maybe a little bit more vulnerable to, to deficitary functionings of the AI bots, and then we have serious interaction. So that's already the case. Whether, it makes a difference, if the AI downloads your podcast or Christian Peters does, I would say it makes a difference, because hopefully Christian Peter is going to do something with the podcast, and it's going to play a role to the way that people are, having lives and are working with what they hear and critically use the information and the data. So
but will there not come a point that AI can do the same thing, where it's going to learn and form an opinion, and the AI itself will change based on, I've listened to Andy on that UFO podcast, and it's even got, I don't want to get into podcasting too much, it's my other passion, but even like in terms of listening to an advert on a podcast, could there be a benefit from an AI bot listening to an advert, that it's not going to go buy the deodorant, but is there something that it can take from it that's useful to an advertiser? And I wonder, is it going to get to that place quickly where actually there's a real benefit to AIs and bots, and that's what I say. Maybe forget me plugging the podcast, but there actually comes a point, it's you're just having those interactions as if it's another person, and you don't even differentiate. And I wonder, then, do you get to a point where that's where you get this assimilation of society, where instead of shunning it and going bots, 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 which everyone does just now, you actually embrace it, and bots, human, what's the difference?
well, it depends on, it depends on many things. It really, I mean, like, if you I have made to people the argument that it would be healthy to deal with AI in the way that you're dealing with people, because for one reason, not for, you know increasing the value of the AI. Excuse me.
And that's okay.
But in order to have your social immunity system work properly, to be as skeptical about the AI as you are about, your fellow people around you. So use the knowledge that you have in, dealing with the world, um, and take those categories in dealing with something that obviously seems to collectively influence societies and people, on the micro level, because you already know how to deal with conflict, so you could ask yourself, uh, you know is it beneficial if the bot is interacting with, uh, with your podcast? I would say one of the first things that AI is going to do is it's probably going to maximize its efficiency in an economic sense, because that has happened pretty much with all the technologies that hit societies, at large, and efficiency, uh, economic advantage is one of the main functioning principles of platform capitalism, AI capitalism, if you want. So uh, I would think that this would be probably one of the first things that you're seeing. They would probably use your chat to find out whether it's interesting. Also, to post you into some context. Be Such a bot would probably realize that's the profile of people looking your show, and so that's going to make Instagram more interesting. I Yesterday I told a friend, uh, because you were saying about, what Instagram is showing you. I would say, I told a friend, it would be so cool if there would be a reset button at Instagram where you can
Mm,
push, and it'll flats down your algorithm,
yeah.
everything that it has learned about your, the consumption patterns that you have, because every once in a while they take a weird turn, and you're getting, in your case, you're getting all those crashing airplanes that would amplify the fears. And I don't know, I'm getting, at the moment, I'm getting nice boxer dogs, because I'm a dog nerd. I love dogs, so I get, like boxer puppies and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But I also get a lot of videos of homeless people, that are depending, that are shooting, like fentanyl. And I
Mm,
don't know, because I followed that, because at one point I've realized that, this is one of the real, grave concerns that people should have, that drugs have optimized themselves to a degree that they dehumanize people in just a very short time. And those
yeah.
fentanyl zombies, it's very tragic. So that's the two things I'm getting, and I feel like if I could press that release button now, it would show me something else. My friend told me, why should they do that? Because if you get a random sample of whatever videos, you wouldn't spend time on Instagram, because it would bore you. But now it's got you hooked, and you're sitting there, and you're watching, you know, videos, ads on stupid shit nobody really needs to buy. But that's how they capitalize on that. So let's not maybe not get too far away from the UFO topic, but
No,
I
no,
think,
yeah,
but I
the
think,
AI
but
stuff
I
is
think
really
there. No, no,
interesting.
no, it's great, and I could go on, because that's a topic that really bothers me. I'm literally, working on AI in a political context at the moment at the university and research, but I think they're all connected, and I think these topics are connected. They are massively connected. If you look at the UAP environment now, trying to, get the bend, uh, I'm seeing very often discussions by very reasonable people telling me that they talk to ChatGPT, and the answers that they get, are about the nature of the universe, and somebody speaks to them, and I'm quite skeptical in the idea that there is a channeling of an extraterrestrial or interdimensional entity through ChatGPT, because ChatGPT is quite a clever tool.
Well, listen, that's one extreme, but the other extreme is literally yesterday I asked it how long I had to cook a 92-gram frozen chicken breast for, and it told me 10 to 12 minutes in my air fryer. at 180 would do, and it did not. I needed at least 18 minutes. So ChatGPT may be having huge conversations about, the meaning of life for some folks, but for me, it can't tell me. And that's ChatGPT 5.1. I pay for ChatGPT. Could not tell me the right amount of time to cook frozen chicken breast, folks. So do be wary of using it far too much for that. But to zoom out a little bit, obviously you study political culture, social attitudes, and we've touched on some of that here. How have you seen the public narrative around UFOs evolve? And I'm thinking even people who study this, who are far older or younger, from the early Cold War, post-war decades to the X-Files era of the 90s, and now we've talked about the social media age. What's standing out for you about the cultural shift around the UFO conversation?
That's a really good question. I it, it's a bit hard to say because the problem with history is that I have a certain I have a certain feeling to on about what happens at the moment, but when it comes to the 80s, the 70s, and the 50s, I'm literally blind by experience because I didn't live. So I have to rely on what people are saying. But when you study the cases and when you look at the books that have been published, and when you're following, I don't know, maybe the narratives of ufology, and there has been a grand body of wonderful work that has been produced over time, and you can differentiate between the ones that you feel like I would like to take them seriously more than others that might have been produced for being part of a UFO community that has conventions and that generates capital. Anyway, there are shifts in the discussion, and interestingly, I think that you can see uh, a relationship between that what people are seeing and are reporting, and something that fits into the time. The What do I mean with that? Uh, I think that the way that I mean, there's within ufology, people would say, it's there is an interrelationship between what people can see, and that is codified by the cultural environment that they live in. Because when you are living in an environment that is, let's say, before the first Zeppelin has ever flown, everything that was around were just these hot balloons. But apart from that, there was no directed flying because there has, before Lindbergh and the Wright brothers, there has been no art plane. So your imagination would be technically limited. And that's what they're saying about those cases of the so-called, I forgot how the flying ships, late 19th century, the
Flying
14
airships and
flying
yeah,
airships, exactly.
yeah.
Thank you. So there is, it kind of plays with the cultural and the very precise imaginary of people. That's what they can see because we are uh, arguably humans are trained to see patterns. We can't just see things how they are, but we are conditioned to see patterns because if we wouldn't be conditioned to see patterns, we would permanently be overwhelmed by everything that happens around us because there is so much happening at each and every moment, and you're just trained to see the things that are stable, that and if you're in a room surrounded by artifacts that have a personal history to you, that level of stability is even higher. But if you go outside and let's say at Times Square, you're there is a lot of stuff going on Times Square at 12
Mm.
noon, and you could be absolutely overwhelmed by the data that comes in, but people are seeing patterns, stuff they've seen already. And so that goes on. I think that this is some of the um, keys of understanding how people have looked at the UAP topic and have seen things. It would be, though, Andy, a different question to talk about, but what is the social and political impact of that? Not only what have they seen with respect to the things, you know, it was flying saucers at one point, and somewhat in the 60s, 70s with the early cases of abductions, but definitely with the appearance of communion and X-Files later on, like the omnipresence of the stereotypical gray that has not been, in many of the old UFO cases, the things that were described looked quite different than that. I mean, 50s, 60s UFO descriptions, they've seen very, very weird robot-like entities and huge wolves and small green and large looking like jellyfish or whatever. So there was a big variance. And today we're talking a lot about grays. We're talking a lot about Nordics, and there are also cultural histories of those emanations, because I'm not ultimately convinced that this what people are reporting when it comes to personalities or people or entities um, would be in all cases the representation of a physical reality. I think the phenomenon is more complex than that. I think that maybe even the opposition between observing something and being the observer and or the something that is seen might be very more complex when it comes to certain aspects of the phenomenon. So I'm being cautious and even agnostic when it comes to that. But the impact, that what we really can talk about, that has changed. That has changed, and that has massively changed over the last 8 years. Talking from 2017 on until today. I think that the UAP phenomenon and the way that it's impacting societies, cultures, and people is right now at a historical point it hasn't been before. And that has to do, in my opinion, with the nature of the media environment, the way that these things are reaching into people's lives, the fact that you can literally, build an epistemic environment around that through the algorithms of your favorite social software, where you're not seeing much more else. We're there's a fragmented chance of being a very, very deep in the UAP rabbit hole, being fed by a huge machine. And I'm not saying somebody, with clandestine interests is behind that. It's just something that appears. And I guess the way that people are processing this information, therefore, will look different. Both the message and the media has changed over time. And in the 60s, in the 70s, I mean, I do not find it very surprising that the X-Files was presenting the case the way it presented it, because it's
Hmm.
it's in a time um, where trust into governments was reaching the low points that we've seen. It's the politically speaking, since the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in all Western liberal democracies, we've seen a certain erosion of trust in governments. There were amplitudes over time that had to do with wonderful presidents or like changes. The when the Iron Wall came down, there was a huge boost of self-confidence on the Western sphere, because they thought that there was a triumph of capitalism over communism. But that has changed over time. At the moment, we're politically speaking in an environment where trust in governments is lowest it has been in very, very long times. And that has, of course, an impact also on the way that people are dealing with the UAP topic, because it's much easier to think that a potentially hostile government is hiding stuff from you, because it already falls into that fertile ground of widely shared loss of trust in governments. But if you allow me to say that, because it connects to what I've said in at the Soul Foundation. And at the same time, I must say, because I have really looked closely at the what I would call a realistic approach on looking at the political system, at institutions. Also, there is reasons to be dubious about what governments know or don't know
Mm,
with respect to the UAP topic, because what the UAP represents is, it's a serious sovereignty crisis to modern statehood. Take the US as, one of the still being one of the leaders militarily, economically, probably, at least in self images culturally as well. But anyway, the United States is one of the world powers. And what does being a world power mean? That means capability over all other nations, or at least in tight competition with the other world powers. You are power, it's about power, it's about capability, military, like ruling airspace, knowing what happens in the oceans, being top notch technologically speaking. That is modern sovereignty, and it is represented by governments. There is a relationship between the two. What does the UAP do? It's the contradiction of that. If
mm.
it's true what we're seeing, it's saying you're not the number one. You're not even number three on what we've seen. You are very, very far down a potential road, and we are technologically more capable. You don't know what we are. So there's is potentially some sort of an information disbalance. And that is something that political sovereigns are having serious problems with. If you're in an authoritarian state, something that is such a deep threat to your raison d'etre, the reason that you're there, can be totally blocked away. It's part of the censorships. That stuff we don't talk about because it's problematic for ourselves. In Western societies, it's not that easy. So I don't know. It makes sense that they're not sharing the details with us, and that's
When
probably
you Yeah, when you say the stuff we don't talk about, I have to bring back the conversation around experiencers, because I think they have to have their moment in the conversation. You mentioned how interested you are in the data around that, and how that experience a conversation, Christian, for me looks is I will always listen to someone sharing their story, their testimony. Whether I believe it or not, I try not to believe or disbelieve. I like to just take it at face value, and there's nothing I can really do in terms of experiencers other than if people want to share with me, I'm more than happy to listen because sometimes that's all people want or need. But I can't do anything with that. I'm not a psychologist. I wouldn't want to dive into that any further. I don't want to explore that with someone. It's not my job to do that. I wouldn't feel comfortable for multiple points of view. But in terms of experiencers, how do you view that particular phenomenon? Because it is difficult, and I've hosted many experiencers on the podcast, many. And I hope anyone listening to this, I've said this enough now that they understand my take on it. I think there is there's an element of people who perhaps are suffering from a mental health issue that it manifests as an experience, and that could be UFOs, ghosts, demons, werewolves, shadow people, paranoia, whatever it may be. That's that's not always to say that that mental health issue isn't brought on by a genuine abduction experience, whatever that may be. But how do you go about discerning that whole conversation? You don't just believe everyone, you don't just disbelieve everyone. And again, to frame it in a modern way, and sorry if I'm ranting a bit here, but you look back, it seemed to me that growing up, knowing the UFO topic as I did, most of the cases, it was the same 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 cases that were discussed from the 60s all the way through to the 90s. The same magazines wrote the same cases. Betty and Barney Hill, Calvin Parker, Bob Lazar, all that kind of stuff came out. But then with the social media age, you mentioned earlier, if something crashed in Times Square within seconds, it's on Instagram. We all have access to probably too much information too quickly that you don't know what to do with it. You just, oh, that's interesting, swipe away. Oh, look, a nuclear bomb's going off in a capital city somewhere. Wow, isn't that terrible? Swipe away. Oh, look, boxer dogs. That's the algorithm and it's what we're being fed. So how do you decide who's being truthful, who's not being truthful? Is that even the point of the conversation? And what would you want to do with the data itself?
It's I really like the way that you're approaching that because it's sensitive, and I think you said that. I think the the truth question, is that true? I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Did it happen in a universe that works like like a machine? Is everything that this person has seen or uh, things to have seen, did that manifest on a physical level of reality or didn't it? And and that is probably the way that you're looking at that, if you're a strong natural history person and a natural scientist, because you have a very, very clear idea about what reality actually means. um, See, I'm a social scientist, and within the social sciences, we have something that is called the interpretive social science. That is looking at what people are making, the meaning that brings people together, the idea of nationhood, what it means to be a Scotsman and an independent, stuff like that. That's connected to things that happen inside people. They are subjective to a certain degree, and to me, I'm very, very careful about asking, for example, the question. You could say one of the first filter question, and I must say I'm not an expert on experiences. That's not absolutely my cup of tea, and there are people like Michael Bolender and other people you want to talk to who have a more definite and probably a more outspoken approach to that. But something I can tell you, what has been irritating me about that is that I've heard that within the community, within our community, I've heard people say that one of the first things that we should do is, bring in some sort of a filter test, somebody saying something, where we, first test, is there a likelihood that this is, I don't know, some sort of a sudden phase of paranoid schizophrenia? Are they triggered by something? Is the hardware working properly, or isn't it? Um, and and then the next thing, check them socially. Is this somebody other people are going to tell you can trust him or you can't? And you know do what people do when they walk along and talk, go into a pub and talk to somebody and they're telling them quite an amazing story. The first thing that you're doing, correlating the amazingness to, who is talking to me, as a matter of fact. And when it's getting really crazy, is it, worth the time spending here? And if that person seems to be serious, probably you're staying longer and listening to that. So you could
Mm.
do that, and you can find all sorts of indicator telling that they have a, good professional background, that they've been, in the military and doing this and that and this and that. But something that bothers me about that is that both of those tests are tried they're trying to exclude that either the people are mentally ill, or they're lying. So you're coming with some sort of an approach to that which is actually presented, which is, the content of the witnessing, the data, if you want. And the first things that you're doing about that data is you're giving those data a framing that has an enormous amount of doubt in that. And if we're permanently, we're complaining about, having to justify ourselves as UAP researchers permanently again and again, because we're approached by society with a generalized doubt, that we have to fight against, and nobody takes that, what we want to say, serious, which is part of, I think that there is a lot in the UAP topic you should take seriously because it reflects some of the political issues that you're dealing with on other levels. UAPs and climate change are quite structurally, similar with the way that they're going to affect the global community. And and yet you have to defend yourself in, are you out of your mind or aren't you? Are you taking this seriously or aren't you not taking that seriously? And there is, that's some sort of a negativity impulse that I have. Secondly, if you want, if just for a second you think that some of those people really have to share something, and if they know that they first have to go through the mills of being trialed and tested, mentally as well as socially and culturally, it it'll probably not increase the chance that you get to the core of it. It sometimes reminds me of, what the church is doing, what the protocol of the Roman, what the Roman protocol says about exorcism. The first thing you have to do before finding out whether they're possessed by a demon is finding out whether they're mentally ill or not. And 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 also I did always find that quite, in a sense I found it funny. I think that
Mm.
there are different reasons for the church to put that, at the beginning of a test. Probably it's something that you maybe should do because possession, like massive possession, I don't know, could be something that very closely resembles certain types of uh, mental health issues. There might
Yeah.
be structural analogies, but I wouldn't want to do that with an experiencer who tells me stuff. I don't know, like stuff that I've heard lately, about, very, very rational people sitting in the living room. Suddenly, like a ball of light enters the living room, rests for a while, and disappears. And it happened to my grandfather. I learned that 2 days ago.
Wow.
That was a shock. And then I talked to people who are telling me, of course, I mean, that's a typical case of orbs. We're seeing that very often. And if I then, the first question is, did my grandfather drink too much, or did he? And I'm not taking that serious. I think those witness reports would probably have a threshold that they would not necessarily have to step over. However, Andy, I agree that we cannot, the consequence of what I just said cannot be that there is an absolute anything goes and everybody can say what they want and there will be a large audience who takes that seriously. I react allergically to what you could probably call some sort of an intuitive filter when I realize that people are telling me, complex stories about otherness and what they want and what they are and things that only they would know because they talked that in their
Yeah.
ears. And I don't want that. So we need to find middle grounds on working with the qualitative data and the stuff that people experiences would be telling, because I really think that it matters. I think it's part of the phenomenon. It probably sheds light at a certain area of it that we have not taken seriously yet. I don't know what it means. I don't know if what we're going to find out has nothing to do with the stuff that we're seeing in our skies. I don't know, but I think it's serious and important.
I mean, I'll share a story with you. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. I can't be sure. However, I'm going to leave some details out just to protect the identity of the person. Um, I wouldn't think they're massively well known necessarily. However, I'd just rather not go into certain details for multiple reasons. However, in the early days of the podcast, I was invited to attend a virtual meeting with a group. I'll just say a group based somewhere in the world. Not super secret. I mean, literally just ordinary members of the public who are into UFOs. Um, and it was to watch some presentations. And one person speaking, who was a potential guest, I was recommended to have on, shared their presentation, and they discussed their lifetime of abduction experiences. However, the abduction experience began, and they shared this during a massive trauma. And I'm not going to say what it was happened to them, but it happened in childhood, and it's horrific. And for me, that just sounds like the abduction trauma is, maybe it did happen genuinely, but it sounds for me it's masking the really horrific thing that happened to them through their childhood. And they shared that on this presentation, and I found it really uncomfortable. But then there's a lot of folks that were part of that who are, they almost encourage that's a credible conversation to have, and for me, that's someone who needs help. But again, that's for me where I'll always listen to someone's story. And I've spoken to so many other experiencers where I do genuinely believe that something has happened to them. At least they believe it's truly happened to them. Maybe it happened physically. I've often shared the idea that I could well believe that if I was in bed beside my wife all night and say I didn't go to sleep and just watched her, and she woke up in the morning and said to me, I was abducted last night, and I could say, you weren't. I watched you all night. Maybe her consciousness was abducted. Maybe time is frozen and I had no idea. Maybe I've been manipulated. Perhaps that's an element of this. But I think there's so many difficult aspects of the experience of conversation. It does upset some people, but I do understand why, for example, the Sol Symposium doesn't have multiple experiencers stand on stage and have those conversations. I've often used the example, if let's pick someone, I don't know, Gary Nolan, Christopher Mellon, Lou Elizondo, any of these figures who have been sitting on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, Sky News, BBC, whatever news network you watch. If I'm just going to pick Luis Elizondo just because it's the first name, okay?
Mm-hmm.
If he sits on Fox News and says what he's said over the years, but then shares, actually, I was abducted once as well, every single conversation he has from then on a mainstream news network is the abduction experience. And I think it's laughed at. I think people use it to poke and prod and make fun. I think there's a lot of folks in very senior positions, military, academically, and government, who probably have had experiences that do not share them because they do not want to go down that road in that conversation. And I very much think experiencers will have their time. But for the love of God, I don't know how we get to that conversation publicly without huge ridicule, turning folks off. And it's easy for some folks who are very, very experienced or pushy. Everyone's telling the truth. It's too easy to say, yes, everyone has to hear this. Most of the public don't want to hear it or laugh at it or find it mental, for lack of a better word. And I just don't know how we bridge that gap at the minute.
Wonderfully said. I two things come to my mind. Remember on when we talked maybe an hour ago about the way that like the realization of the UAP phenomenon and its nature might be a question of distance and proximity.
Mm-hmm.
It took me a while until I realized that probably the shunning away from the experiencer topic has to do with the fact that it's the ultimate proximity, because somebody is telling a story that is a personal story. They're talking about what they have been going through. So it has a reality that already brings in an interpretation of what is going on. Sometimes, some of those stories are about communication, which is fascinating because, on the one side, some say we're seeing UAPs in our airspace and we don't know what is behind that. And then there is this enormous, body of data where there is, where there has been exchanges and people, information has been exchanged. I'm not saying that either one of them is true or isn't true, but I'm just observing that. And so you could say that while, a close encounter of the second kind where you see something and it's clearly there and it can't be explained away because it's zigzagging and even somebody's taking a picture of that. it is not within our technological inventory. So it's the proof of something beyond human, and it's something that obviously is technologically capable, or it's a natural phenomenon that seems to be intelligible, and maybe the differentiation between nature and technology is also something that is generally, anthropocentric, and there are other, I don't know if they've been around for 4 billion years as a civilization. Probably the difference between that which is natural and that which isn't has blurred over time. So I like that post-biological hypothesis. We've heard Diana Pasulka talk about that and so on. The 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 experiencer is in that proximity and distance spectrum the absolute closeness. And if then the ridicule correlates to the extent of how this information is is asking existential questions, of course, the experiencer is the ultimate, it's the ultimate bomb, because they're telling you very weird stories about stuff that has been told to them, or the Ariel kids that many of them seem to have gotten information about that we should be more sustainable with the way that we're dealing with our
Yeah.
environments, and blah 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 blah, stuff that bothers people anyway, because we know that we're fucking up the environment, and you want to look away. So don't look up, don't look down, don't look into the forest. Where do you want to look? Don't look at the experiencer, because the experiencer has a lot of bad news for you. You could say
Yeah.
that, that this is a dimension, uh, and also something that comes with the experiencing is that there seems to be at least to the extent that I know that, there seems to be quite a heterogeneity of things that are told. There's a lot of difference, many different stories, and they have to do with the fact that it goes through people's interpretations. If you're going through something as traumatic as what Whitley Strieber has gone through on his cabin, uh, and you have a lifetime to contemplate about that, not everybody is probably ending at the same result. So there is a big variance in the way that people are interpreting something that doesn't fit into their, into the way that they expected the world to function. Something that I also find interesting is whether the ridicule and the tendency to disbelieve is a very modern phenomenon, because we're living in an environment where Max Weber has said that the history of modernity is one of a permanent disenchantment. Once you had angels and demons, and trusting God, and everybody knew what their position is. That has kind of a little bit broken down. you
Yeah.
know there are many people, religious people in the audience here. I'm not threatening you by any means, but I'm just making some sort of a sociological observation here. Um, if you would have said 250 years ago that you've seen a shiny being talking to you, uh, the discussion probably wouldn't have been whether that happened or it didn't happen. The question would have been, has this been the devil, or has it been angels speaking to you?
Hmm.
Interestingly, most of the people that would report those things, back in the 16th and 1700s, especially if they were women, they would be certainly under the, now I'm lacking the English word, Verdacht, you say in German, the suspicion that they've been visited by the Beelzebub, or by the devil, that they've been interacting with something which is not godly, because it
Hmm.
was transported into the ideological environment of the time, and the theological interpretation of the likelihood of somebody who is not a priest, or who hasn't studied the Bible for many years, having a real angelic encounter. What I want to say is that trusting or distrusting something that sounds anomalous also is a function of the time that you're living in. So, and my last point that I would want to make is that I realize that the the experiences story is so problematic because it's not only problematic to the people who listen to you, but it's problematic to the people who go through it. And I agree with you that there is a fine line between trauma and screen memory that might not be screen memory put over, an alien that then appears as an owl, but that might be an alien is the screen memory for your uncle or for somebody else who is intrusive in your environment. That is certainly out there somewhere. Uh, so it's troubling. Something you said before reminded me of the last point I want to make on your question here, and that is when you said, I would be in my bedroom and I would look at my wife, and nothing happens at night. You hear her, turn around more often than she does, but nothing spectacular
Yeah.
happens. Given that you had the patience to watch her 8 hours in a row sleeping,
Nothing
that's
spectacular happens in our bedroom at night, I can assure folks. Yeah.
I'm not wanting to say that. It's just a sign of serious love to watch
Yeah.
your beloved ones for 8 hours and,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
guarding their sleep. But anyway, and then she wakes up and tells you, I've been adopted. And she looks into your eyes in the same way that she's done for 25 years or for however long you have been married, because she is the person you trust.
Mhm.
She's in a sense, unless you have a dysfunctional relationship, but let's, idealize that for a second. She is the embodiment of your normative compass, of the way you're sharing a similar view on reality. You learn to trust her. And I find that fascinating when the phenomenon shows up in those constellations. What does it do to your significant others, and how are you processing that? And and I have, not naming names, but one of the people in Germany that is, rather known in the OAP environment, and he's a he's a serious researcher. He's a natural scientist, and he's very rational, and he's very structured, uh, and I met him on a conference, and on some sort of a small talk, as the conversation goes, especially when it's about UAP, what brings you here? And this incredibly rational, structured, down to earth thinking, scientist who is working, in the light of public attention at a well-known German university, says, my father has seen several UFOs, and then there was some sort of a close contact scenario that was really incredible. And you hear that from that person, and you think, wow, that there's some sort of an antithesis here which I don't get. But the point is, it took me a while to understand, is that the truth and the believing into what people present as the truth is something that is infectious. That's
Mm.
also why these narratives are propagating, because if I would tell my best friend tomorrow, and I can tell you because that happens in my environment. My friends are seeing me taking that serious, and taking the topic serious, and not starting the conversation with, I don't believe in UFOs, but I'm a social scientist that has understood that this is an interesting topic to be concerned with, because right now they talk about UAP in the American Congress. That's something that should concern a political scientist to a certain degree. No, I'm not entering that discussion like that anymore. I have changed because I'm originally interested, and I'm not excluding the possibility that this is all. There is so much smoke, so there will be a fire at somewhere. It might be something that is shockingly different to what most people that are listening right now think, and that I might even think. It could be something absolutely different, shockingly different to that. But uh, the the thing is, a person that you love and that you trust significantly comes to you and tells I think, I've seen it, or I really think something is true to it. And here is why I find that so interesting, because when I haven't seen anything, but I have talked to people. I think I said that on a podcast recently. I'm not an experiencer, but I'm an experiencer of experiences. What I
Mm,
see is I talk to people that tell me what they've seen, and again, it it doesn't make sense. They're down to earth. Some of them are driven by a weird energy, and I understand that's trying their intellect to close the cognitive gap that they're going through with what they thought that reality is, and what they now seen shaken, so-called ontological shock. But uh but and that is infectious. I mean, I don't know, Andy, you've talked to many of those people. It probably, the more you've talked to them, and the more, rational minded, convincing, down to earth, trusting people I've talked. I remember that 2 or 3 years ago I talked to a farmer, a potato farmer from Idaho, who made an enormous amount of money with airplanes that are spraying detergent over the potato flowers. A rich person, but and I really liked him a lot, but I wouldn't say that there was an incredible sci-fi imagination working in the
mm,
background. And the story that he told me was absolutely amazing
yeah.
about missing time. I could go on hours talking about my favorite case in Argentina. I think I shared with you a few information about that anthropologist that went through the desert and has seen these orbs and tells this story. It's not making sense. it These are I trust them. I believe them. I can't believe what they say that they've seen because it's so outrageous, but I trust the people. And in that sense also, I guess the experience, the dimension of meaning, and what this could be, and the people talking about that has some sort of an infectiousness. And don't get me wrong, that's not the infectiousness of a collective psychosis. It's just something that people have been doing for 150,000 years, and that's oral culture, talking about stuff and convincing your next and neighbor about the story because that is something that has convinced you. And that's something that in modernity kind of has lost its value, and I regret that. I think we're much too visual. It should be
Yeah.
more.
Do you know, I think when it comes to the UFO topic, I'll go by the mantra that we can't all be right, but we can all be wrong. So I
Good
think that
mantra.
that covers a lot of the topic for me. In regard to those conversations, I think that was my biggest takeaway from Saul was getting to speak to folks who have some incredibly lofty positions across so many different disciplines, people who genetically create incredible medicines, perform incredible medical feats, would be at the higher end of businesses, academia, and that they would come and chat and say hi. They listen to this podcast, which was lovely to hear from folks in space agencies coming and speaking to me, who were
Wow.
like, I don't want my name mentioned. I want to introduce myself. Love this topic. They would either share an incredible experience. I can, do you know, here's a different one for you. I had a book signing, just to get away from Sol for a minute. People are sick of that. I had a book signing in a small town in Scotland last September time, and around 40 people, which was sold out. So go me, turned
Great.
up, and I'd say a third of the people in the room knew who I was. Maybe half. The other half were just folks who attended these types of things and events because it's a small town. And one of the gents came up to me who in the town is pretty well known because of his business. Um, and he was so well dressed and a bit older, 60s, definitely 60s at least. And he was like, I just love a few minutes of your time privately, if you don't mind. And he told me his background. He told me kind of why he doesn't talk about this stuff with people. He didn't know me or the podcast, but he heard there was a UFO book signing thing, and he's like, "Can I show you a video that I took?" And genuinely, it might be one of the best UFO videos I've ever seen. And I'm only really thinking and saying that now. He didn't send me it, but it's a video that he took daylight, which I always love at daytime, on his phone. And you know, when someone's of a certain age and they try and show you something on their phone and it takes them ages to find it because they're still not too sure on apps and their camera roll and he's the glasses and he's scrolling up and down. And if he is listening to this, then I hope I'm doing the story justice. And he says, you know, I saw this thing and I know everyone. It's one of those villages. He went, everyone knows everyone. And because of the job this guy does in his position, he was like, everyone knows me. And I saw this thing. Imagine a kind of Calvin-esque backdrop. And he said, this thing just goes across the sky. And quite often people send me videos and I'll say, it looks like it's balloons or it looks like it's birds. This wasn't any of these. This was very clearly something silver, metallic, not too high up either, going across a pretty clear sky with the green hills in the background. There was a kind of farmhouse in the distance that gave me an idea of how high off the ground it was, and it was very clearly spinning, and you could see the three parts of this thing spinning, and it just keeps going. And I was like, that's really and I thought when the guy was telling me this, I went, it's going to be bullshit. It's not going to be clear. It's not going to be it's going to be balloons. And I'm happy to say to someone, that looks like a party balloon. That looks like a bunch of balloons. It genuinely, I was like, in my head, I'm racking my brain going, what could that be? Because even though I do this, I want to go, it's got an explanation. Genuinely fucking stumped. I was like, mate, that is a very good video. He said he even called the people who lived in the farmhouse at the time to say, did you know of blah, blah, blah? Nope. He said there was also lights reported that night, etc. in the area. People around there know each other. They phoned each other. And genuinely, one of the best UFO videos I've ever seen.
Was
Yeah.
there a second witness to that? Or did like farm did somebody else?
Not
Did you?
not that I spoke to, but other people had said they had saw the same thing. Other folks in the village reported over a day or so they had seen silver object going across the sky. But the guy had a really good video. And like I say, if you saw it, you wouldn't be able to look at it and go, it's a flying saucer or a disc. Looking back, imagine if someone took three kind of not balls, but kind of maybe egg-shaped objects and stuck them together so they were like, you know, three
Well,
in a sort
yes,
of triangle, but they just rotated, but it moved and it didn't
sounds
go
like
up
a
or down.
60s. It's like a 60s furniture piece.
But, yeah, like a lampshade, like your aunties would have or your granny would have a lampshade like this, yeah. And it was there, and I was like, Jesus, it was so good. But anyway,
It's
I can't remember the point of telling you that, but that for me was such an interesting video.
No, I know the point. The point is really fascinating because what you've just done is now you've kind of confirmed. I think all the audience. I'm talking to you right now at the moment. Look at yourself and look at how this what Andy has been reported. How you are evaluating that, because I really think we've been talking about the infectiousness of narratives, and of course, it could be true that both you and I are just talking bullshit. I mean, you're having a podcast and you have interest in people listening to you, and I'm a scientist who enjoys the audience and the publicity. But if we take that aside and that what you've just reported, which doubtlessly has happened, then this is exactly that moment where this story translates into something. The way that you've introduced that elderly gentleman, it's just not making much sense. Yeah,
Mm,
why would he do that? If that's the story that happened, why? Of course, he could have fun in I don't know, having gaslightings and try to get the conversation. I mean, it might be that the CIA or whoever has 150,000 people cleverly placed all across this globe, permanently seeding
yeah.
those stories because they cover up a very deep tech project that they're working with. But I don't know. I think we would have heard more about that apart from the story that we read in the Washington Journal that was suggesting that this was the case, but doing that in a very, very unprofessional way, in my opinion.
Christian, what I want to do, because we have been
Yes,
going nearly 2 hours now.
right.
I Full disclosure is not the name of this episode, but I had a whole format for this episode, and it has gone completely out the window. I've still got half the interview at least that I wrote down. What I'd love to do is kind of wrap up and invite you back on in a couple of weeks' time, or before Christmas, after Christmas, if
Always,
you can,
whenever you
because
want.
there's so many different ways I'd love to go with this, and I think people would perhaps want to send in some questions as well to close off on. Is there any final point you would like to make, just to kind of wrap up? Perhaps you're thinking where you're at. Where do you think this is going to go based on someone like yourself's involvement, the articles you've written, being at Sol, the people you've spoken to? Where are we at?
The I think we literally haven't talked about, what I said at Saul, and I've gotten some really good feedback. I think there was a substance to that. I mean, I don't know if you heard that and if you liked it, but and you wouldn't say
I did
something,
attend. Yep.
you wouldn't say something else, but the the point that I would like to make is that people, I no, it's not, I can't go with, and the and the truth of the story is this and that. I'm not there yet. What I want to do is I want to tell people that I really think that the social and the political dimension of this topic is something that has been to a certain degree underestimated over time. I think there are ways that you can approach that. If you would want to talk me about that at one point, I'm happy to do so. Uh, I think that the reality of the UAP topic, both of the topic and the way that it unfolds in society, is much more complex than some of the discussions that we're having on that. And I think that we're all at the beginning here. And if I, people that I talk to, and they say, Chris, when it comes to politics, you have a rather bleak assessment of the situation. And I'm like, it sounds so, there is not so much we can do because it's deeply ingrained in the way that politics and political institutions are working. And there's this sovereignty dilemma and how to get out of that. And that's not what I would like to transport. I appreciate the discussion that the both of us are having here. I appreciate the discussion that happens in a science that start to circle around the UAP topic. I'm not calling it UAP studies because I don't think that that's where we're at. We're far away from that. It's
Mm.
still such a founding phase and so many conflicting and differing, and the interdisciplinarity is not regulated, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. But there is a crystallization that takes place. And also what I appreciate is that I have witnessed instances of talking to people who are not in the UAP camp that start taking that seriously to a certain degree. Maybe because they realize that all their life they've been going to the movies and watch sci-fi that were telling them stories about ETs all along, but there seems to be some sort of a magic line that they drew that, this is where reality starts and that's where my imagination ends. And maybe that there are over blurring areas. So the discussion is opening up. And the last call that I would make is don't I know that within the UAP community and also within the the disclosure community, science already comes in with some sort of a backpack. You're always asking the complex questions, and we need to progress from here. And we have to ramp up, and we have to prepare and talk about ontological and catastrophic disclosure and blah blah blah. I think it's good to be careful, and I think it's good to make small steps at first because the dimension, the potential dimension of this is enormous. And I'm not saying that people will disappear or civilization, is going to implode or whatever. I don't think actually that there is so much of a catastrophic disclosure because one thing that we know about people and societies and political entities is that they're incredibly adaptive. We're permanently underestimating the power of the human mind, the imagination, the way that we're progressing intellectually. There is a lot of adaptive potential, but it needs to be framed, and it's not coming from itself. So try to make small steps to be ready for big steps that might come rather sooner than later. I still hope.
That's all for this episode of That UFO podcast. Thank you so much for listening and watching. If you enjoyed the show, please follow, subscribe, and leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps others find the show. If you're watching on YouTube, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. You can also support the show directly and get early access, ad-free episodes, and bonus content on Patreon, or by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube memberships. All the links are over at thatufopodcast.com or in the show description below, along with merchandise and more. Don't forget you can also pick up a copy of my book, Atlas of Unidentified Flying Objects, available now in all good bookstores and through online retailers, including Amazon. Big thank you again to all of you for listening and tuning in. Until next time, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue.